When the world still sleeps and the night slowly loosens its grip, there comes a quiet that feels almost otherworldly. The air is softer, the light has not yet broken, and for a brief moment, everything seems untouched, pure, waiting. This is the sacred moment of morning. It's here, in this fragile silence, that we hold the greatest power. Before your phone blinks awake, before the rush of obligations pulls you out into the noise, you stand at a threshold. The day hasn't yet claimed you. The world hasn't yet spoken. And in this pause, you get to decide, who will I be today? Most of us don't even notice this moment. We tumble out of bed, already carrying yesterday's worries and tomorrow's plans, as if life were just a conveyor belt that never stops. But the Buddha taught that every new dawn is a rebirth. Each morning is an invitation to begin again, with fresh breath, fresh eyes, fresh spirit. Think of it this way: when you plant a seed in the morning, the entire day grows from it. If you plant chaos, you harvest exhaustion. But if you plant clarity, gratitude, and peace, that seed becomes a tree of calm that shades you from the heat of the world. This is why what you whisper to yourself in those first minutes matters more than you think. You are not just waking up your body, you are shaping the entire landscape of your mind. One thought, spoken inwardly with intention, can ripple through every conversation, every challenge, every choice that follows. So imagine if instead of rushing into stress, you began your mornings with 5 simple truths, 5 gentle reminders rooted in ancient Buddhist wisdom, carried across centuries not as rules but as treasures. These aren't empty affirmations, they are guiding lights. They realign you with the deepest part of who you are. Picture yourself tomorrow morning. The room is still dim. You sit up slowly, feeling the rhythm of your breath. And before the day can reach you, you reach yourself. You whisper words that don't just prepare you for the hours ahead, they transform them. In this journey we're about to take together, I will share those 5 truths. Each one is like a key. One unlocks freedom from thoughts that chase you. Another reveals the hidden strength you already carry. Another shields your peace from the storms outside. Another roots you firmly in the present. And the last one, perhaps the most liberating of all, teaches you the art of letting go, so life can flow as it was meant to. But for now, just rest in this image. The candle light flickering in the dark, the quiet promise of a new day, and the awareness that you hold the power to set its tone. Morning is not something that just happens to you. Morning is something you can create. So let us step together into that stillness, into that sacred pause, and begin to plant seeds that will carry us through the day. Not with heaviness, not with pressure, but with wisdom, with calm, with an unshakable center. The morning is still hushed, but now something begins to stir. A thought flickers across your mind. Maybe it's about what you need to do today. Maybe it's about something you forgot yesterday. Maybe it's just a random voice, uninvited yet suddenly loud. This is where many of us lose our peace. Before our feet even touch the floor, the chatter has already begun. The mind becomes like a restless monkey, leaping from branch to branch, one worry, then another, until you're tangled in a forest you never meant to enter. But here is the first truth: you are not your thoughts. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. You are not the endless commentary running in your head. You are not the replay of yesterday's mistakes, nor the rehearsal of tomorrow's fears. Thoughts rise and fall like waves, but you are the ocean beneath them. Imagine standing on a bridge over a busy highway. Cars are rushing past, fast, noisy, unstoppable. Those cars are your thoughts. If you stand in the middle of the road, they hit you, overwhelm you, and carry you away. But if you remain on the bridge, you simply watch. You see them come, you see them go, but they cannot touch you. That bridge is awareness. That silence beneath the noise, that's who you truly are. The Buddha often compared the mind to a monkey, playful, restless, easily distracted. But behind the monkey, there is a watcher. Behind the noise, there is stillness. Behind every thought, there is the one who notices the thought. That is your true self, the one that cannot be shaken by any passing storm. When you wake each morning and whisper, "I am not my thoughts. I am the silence beneath them," you are reminding yourself to take the position of the observer. Instead of being swept away, you watch. Instead of identifying with the storm, you recognize the sky. And the beauty of this is simple. When you stop wrestling with your thoughts, they lose their power. A cloud drifts more quickly when you don't try to hold it. A wave settles faster when you don't fight it. So the next time your mind begins racing, telling you that you're not enough, that you should be worried, that life is too much, just breathe. Place your hand on your heart and say, "These are only thoughts, they are not me." Notice how, in that very moment, a gap opens, a space, a silence, And in that silence, peace begins to flow back in. You don't need to destroy your thoughts. You don't need to control them. All you need is to remember that you are larger than them. Thoughts are visitors. You are the home they pass through. Thoughts are shadows. You are the light behind them. And once you begin to live this way, something extraordinary happens. The mind still produces noise, yes, but it no longer defines you. You become like a calm lake that reflects the world without being disturbed by it. You become rooted, unshaken, free. So tomorrow morning, when the chatter comes, smile gently. Let it arrive, let it pass. And whisper within, I am not my thoughts. I am the silence beneath them. Because once you see yourself as the silence, the noise no longer controls your day. When the noise of thoughts begins to soften, and you settle into that deeper silence, something beautiful reveals itself. Beneath all the rushing and all the worrying, there is a presence that feels whole, untouched, complete. It is like discovering a hidden spring in the desert, quiet, steady, overflowing. Yet so often we live as if we are empty. We wake up already reaching outward, toward our phones, toward other people's approval, toward the endless chase for more. More success, more money, more recognition. We tell ourselves, if I just get this one thing, then I'll finally feel complete. But the moment we grasp it, the hunger returns. The Buddha called this the wheel of craving. It spins endlessly because nothing outside of us was ever meant to fill what is missing inside. Here is the truth we forget. Everything you need is already within you. Think of a seed. From the outside, it looks small, insignificant, but within it already lies the blueprint of the tree, the roots, the branches, the shade, the fruit. Nothing needs to be added, it only needs the right conditions to grow. You are that seed. Inside you lives resilience, compassion, wisdom, joy. These are not qualities you have to borrow from the world. They are your birthright, waiting to unfold. And when you remember this in the quiet of morning, you stop chasing. You stop running in circles. You begin to walk differently through the day, not desperate, not grasping, but rooted. Imagine waking and telling yourself, everything I need already exists within me. Feel the weight of that sentence. It dissolves the illusion of lack. It reminds you that peace is not hiding in tomorrow's paycheck or in someone else's praise. Peace is here, in the steady rhythm of your breath, in the strength of your own heart, in the clarity of your own mind. The great Zen masters often compared it to polishing a mirror. The mirror is already whole. It is simply covered with dust. That dust is our doubt, our craving, our fear. But when we wipe it away, what remains has always been there, our true nature, radiant and complete. So when you sit in the stillness of morning, you don't need to ask the universe to give you more. You don't need to beg life to finally make you enough. You only need to look within and recognize the treasure that's already been waiting. And here is the gift. Once you stop looking outward to fill the void, the world itself transforms. Relationships are no longer chains of need, but expressions of sharing. Work is no longer a desperate climb, but a chance to contribute from fullness. Even challenges lose their sting because you face them not as someone lacking, but as someone already complete. This doesn't mean you stop growing or that life will no longer invite you forward. Growth is natural, just as the seed naturally grows into the tree. But growth no longer comes from emptiness. It comes from abundance. You expand not because you are broken, but because you are already whole. So tomorrow, when you wake and feel the old pull of comparison, when you feel the itch to chase, pause, place your hand on your heart, close your eyes, and remind yourself, everything I need is already here, already within me. Feel how your body softens with that truth. Feel how your mind quiets, how the day no longer feels like a battlefield, but like an open field where you can walk freely. This is the power of remembering who you truly are, not a seeker grasping for scraps, but a being already complete, already luminous. And from that wholeness, the day ahead becomes not a burden, but a gift. When you finally begin to sense the fullness inside you, something shifts. You stop searching so desperately outward, and life feels lighter. Yet, almost immediately, the world will test you. Someone's harsh words, an unexpected problem, the sudden chaos of traffic, noise, responsibilities. And if you're not careful, all that peace you cultivated in the morning can vanish in seconds. But here lies the next truth. As steady as a mountain, nothing outside me has the power to disturb my peace. Think about that for a moment. We often believe that peace is fragile, easily broken by circumstances, by what people say, by what happens at work, by the storms that life throws our way. But the truth is, peace is not something the world gives, and so it cannot be something the world takes away. Peace lives in you. It is yours, and the only way it can be disturbed is if you hand it over. The Buddha once said, "You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger." In other words, the storm is not outside, it begins inside. The insult doesn't wound you, your clinging to it does. The setback doesn't defeat you, your story about it does. Imagine a lake. If the surface is stirred, it reflects nothing clearly. But deep beneath, the water remains calm, untouched. That depth, that stillness, is your true nature. When you stay rooted there, the surface can ripple, but the depths remain unshaken. So tomorrow, when life throws its inevitable tests, pause and remember, the outside world can stir the surface, but it cannot touch the depths of who you are. Picture this: someone criticizes you unfairly. The old reflex is to flare with anger, to defend, to fight. But in that moment, if you return to your center and breathe, you'll see the criticism for what it is: just sound, just words carried on the air. It has no power except the power you give it. Or imagine losing something you value, a job, a possession, even a dream. Of course, grief may rise. But if you remember that peace doesn't come from possessions or circumstances, you realize nothing truly essential has been lost. What you need, what you are, still remains. This truth is not about becoming numb. It is about becoming free. When you know that peace lives in you, unshaken by the outside, life's storms lose their ability to control you. You can walk through chaos and remain calm. You can meet conflict with compassion. You can face loss without losing yourself. The Zen masters often compared it to being like the sky. Clouds may gather, thunder may roar, storms may rage, but the sky itself remains untouched. The sky does not fight the storm, nor does it cling to the sunshine. It simply holds everything vast and free. And so you too can live this way. Not chained by what others say, not shaken by what others do, not enslaved by circumstance. Your peace is not for sale. So tomorrow morning, after you remind yourself of your inner fullness, whisper this truth: nothing outside me has the power to disturb my peace. Say it not as a shield of defiance, but as a gentle remembering. Let it root you like a tree whose branches sway in the wind, yet whose trunk remains unmoved. Because once you know that peace belongs to you, and you alone, the world cannot steal it. When your peace no longer depends on the world outside, you begin to notice something subtle. Much of the weight you carry each day isn't from events themselves, but from the pressure you place upon yourself. The endless to-do lists, the race against time, the quiet fear that if you don't achieve enough, you are somehow less. But here's the truth: pressure is not the same as presence. One exhausts you, the other restores you. Every morning you are given a choice. Will I spend this day drowning in pressure, or will I root myself in presence? Think about how most of us live. Even as we sip our coffee, our minds are already hours ahead, worrying about the meeting, the deadline, the conversation we don't want to have. Or they're trapped in yesterday's regrets, replaying old mistakes like a broken record. And while the body sits in the present, the mind is everywhere else. That is the birthplace of pressure, being torn between 1,000 moments and missing the only one that is real, this one. Presence, on the other hand, is like stepping off the spinning wheel. It is the deep breath that slows everything down. It is the quiet realization that this moment, this very breath, is enough. And when you live in presence, life feels lighter, even if nothing outside has changed. The Buddha often compared life to holding a cup of water. If your hand is tight with strain, the water trembles, spills, becomes difficult to hold. But if your grip softens, the water rests steady. Presence is that soft grip. Pressure is the tight one. So tomorrow morning, whisper to yourself, "Today, I choose presence over pressure." Feel how that changes the rhythm of your breath, how it loosens the weight on your shoulders. You are no longer a slave to the clock, but a partner with time. Each moment is no longer an obstacle, but a doorway. Imagine walking through your day this way. At work, instead of rushing through a task just to finish, you give it your full attention. Suddenly, even simple actions feel meaningful. At home, instead of being half absorbed in your phone, you look your loved ones in the eye and connection blooms. Even in solitude, presence turns silence into sanctuary. Pressure says, "You are not enough unless you do more." Presence whispers, "You are enough, and from that enoughness, you can do what matters." And here is the beauty. When you live with presence, you actually become more effective, not less. Because your energy is no longer scattered across 1,000 worries. It is gathered, whole, focused. Just like sunlight through a magnifying glass, presence turns small moments into powerful ones. So when the day begins to pull you, when the weight of should and must starts pressing down, pause, breathe, return to that inner choice. Today, I choose presence over pressure. Because life is not measured by how much you squeeze into a day. It is measured by how deeply you live each moment of it. When you begin living with presence, you soon discover another truth. Much of the suffering you carry doesn't come from what happens to you, it comes from what you refuse to release. The grudges you replay, the plans you cling to, the fears you hold close as if gripping them tightly could somehow protect you. But life was never meant to be clenched in a fist. It was meant to move, to breathe, to flow. Letting go is not giving up. It is not weakness. It is the quiet courage of trust, the understanding that the river of life knows how to carry you far better than your clinging ever could. Think of your breath. You inhale and then you exhale. If you tried to hold every breath, you would suffocate. Only by letting it go can you live. Life is the same. Yet how often do we hold on to people who have already walked away, to dreams that no longer serve us, to identities that keep us small? We tell ourselves, if I just keep holding tighter, maybe it will work, maybe it won't leave, maybe it won't change. But the truth is, everything in this world is already changing. Holding on doesn't stop that change, it only stops you from flowing with it. The Buddha compared clinging to grasping a burning coal. You think you're holding onto it for safety, but in reality, you're only burning yourself. Letting go, then, is not loss. It is freedom. It is opening your palm and realizing that you don't need to carry what was never yours to begin with. Imagine standing by a river. In your hand is a heavy stone. You've carried it for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be light. And then, finally, you open your hand and drop it into the water. The river takes it effortlessly. And in that moment, you don't feel emptiness, you feel release, you feel flow. This is the invitation of every morning, to whisper to yourself, I am letting go so life can flow. Letting go of yesterday's anger, letting go of tomorrow's fear, letting go of the illusion that you must control everything in order to be safe. Because when you let go, space opens. Into that space rushes clarity, love, and freedom. Into that space, life itself can move through you instead of you endlessly resisting it. Think of a tree in autumn. It doesn't fight to keep its leaves. It releases them gracefully, knowing that in letting go, it makes way for new life. You, too, can live this way, releasing not with bitterness, but with trust. So when the weight of holding on begins to tire you, remember, the river of life is already moving. You don't have to push it. You don't have to dam it. You only have to step into it and let it carry you. And in that surrender, you don't lose yourself. You finally find yourself, lighter, freer, flowing. And so the morning comes full circle. From silence to awareness, from presence to letting go, you begin to see that each truth is not just a line to repeat, but a way to live. This is the gift of practice. It is not about one perfect morning. It is not about never being disturbed, never feeling pressure, never holding on. It is about remembering, again and again, that every day is another chance. Another chance to wake up gently, to breathe deeply, to choose peace over noise, presence over pressure, flow over clinging. Some days you may forget. Some days you may stumble, but even that forgetting is part of the practice. Because the moment you remember again, the moment you whisper, I am not my thoughts, I am the silence beneath them, you return home. Living each day as practice means you don't wait for a perfect future to feel free. You begin now, in the middle of the ordinary, in the sound of a kettle boiling, in the pause between two breaths, in the simple act of placing your hand on your heart and remembering, peace is here, peace is me. And as you live this way day after day, you realize that transformation doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with soft steps, with gentle mornings, with steady practice. The life you long for isn't waiting somewhere far away. It is being shaped quietly in the way you greet each day. So let this morning be more than routine. Let it be a sacred beginning, and let tomorrow be the same. Because every sunrise is not just a new day, it is a new invitation to live lighter, to live freer, to live awake. If these words touch something within you, carry them with you into your day. And if you wish to walk this path a little further, with more stories, more practices, and more wisdom, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. This space is for you. A place to return whenever the world feels heavy. A place to be reminded that you already hold the peace you seek. So breathe in deeply. Smile gently. And let us continue this journey together, one mindful morning at a time.